So it's my pleasure to introduce Marije Michel, who's in the Department of Linguistics and English Language. And I'm delighted that you're able to come along today, Marije. Marije and I have worked together on probably started about 2 years ago now, which was quite an in-depth project looking at how technology might support language learning in cross-cultural contexts, and I was fascinated by many of the things that Marije was doing, and particularly with regard to looking at how language is developing with regard to uses of technology, but also how to look at those from a research and analytical perspective. So I thought that it would be wonderful if Marije would come along and share some of that with us, because she also uses technologies, in very innovative technologies actually, in the research and the analysis of language, including eye tracking software, which is quite a new technology, not actually really being applied at the moment from the learning perspective, and we actually started to talk about that when we were working before. But Marije will say more about that as to how she's using it. So Marije is going to talk about second language learning via synchronous computer-mediated communication. So we look forward to a fascinating presentation, Marije.
So thank you also for coming here, all of you, despite the strike. But I understood it's a strike to working hours, so you're not breaching anything. None of this is. Thanks also for the invitation. It's funny, we're all in the same building, and sometimes there's not happening a lot of interaction. So I think it's a good initiative, and we are also hosting a research group that is focusing on second language learning and teaching. But if you're doing anything that goes into that direction, so also probably in intercultural communication or something like that, please contact me afterwards, and we can see whether you want to talk to a bunch of linguists at one moment. Okay, so what I will be talking about today is the second language learning via synchronous computer-mediated communication. That last bit, synchronous computer-mediated communication, is a very complicated word for computer chat. So the things we do either on Facebook or Skype, so when you write, technically we would need to call it written synchronous computer-mediated communication, because there's also oral communication, so when you talk on Skype or if you use video chat or something like that. But in my focus, I look at the written form. And most of the research in a second language learning acquisition environment has been done in that area. So that's why also the acronym SCMC has become much more used in the form of when relating it to the written computer chat, text chat medium. We call it synchronous computer-mediated communication because there's also asynchronous computer-mediated communication, which would be you post something on a forum and then someone else at a different time looks at it, or a blog or an email. So the synchronous bit is that it's actually at this very moment. Now, I thought it might be a good idea to tell a little bit about from where I come from as my background. So my main research object is, or interest, is second language acquisition. And within SLA research, we broadly could define two areas. So more a cognitive perspective, where you look at language learning as information processing. I don't know whether any of you have seen yesterday, there was an article, I think, by Alman saying that we are not information processors. So it was quite thought-provoking, and I think, but so in a way, it builds a bit on the idea of that you have all kind of information around there. You select your memory, your attention selects what to be processed, and only what gets processed has a chance to be learned. It's a very simplistic way, probably. And in SLA, there's also a big field which we would call more the social cultural perspective, so where you look much more at learning as a social behavior of as a social means we engage in as humans. But in my research, I have usually taken much more a cognitive perspective, although I start also involving much more the social culture perspectives at the moment. Then within the SLA research, I'm very much interested in the language pedagogy. So how can we support learners, teachers, course book writers to make language learning more successful? And then specifically second language acquisition being different from first language acquisition. We know a child is surrounded by language, and at one point it starts learning it and it becomes a successful native speaker. Most of our native speakers are that if they don't have any health conditions. Whereas in second language acquisition, so when you start learning a language at a later age, we know there's a lot of research, and most of us will have experienced that we kind of never reach the same level of success as a native speaker. And from a pedagogical perspective or point of view, it is interesting to see, okay, how does it work and what can we learn from research that we then can apply in the teaching and in the learning and in the design of material. So the focus of my research has been set within task-based language teaching. And task-based language teaching is a methodological approach in second language teaching that takes a task, a real-life task, a target task, as its main means of language teaching. So rather than learning vocabulary items, learning pieces of grammar, and then trying to put those together into language, what you do is you have people perform tasks, and then while they're performing tasks, they use their own resources, they use what they know, they notice also what they don't know, and at that moment you as a teacher or as a material designer can come up with information that supports them to go a step further. But the main idea would always be, okay, the target task is I want to be able to schedule a meeting with my doctor. Now, on the phone, that's quite a difficult task to do as a second language learner. But what you would do, you would derive some pedagogic tasks that step-by-step let people attain that. So those are the building blocks of language rather than coming with distinct items. It's built a lot on the idea that every learner has their own internal syllabus and also have their own internal means that they know and things they don't know yet. So it's very difficult to come up with exactly or with a linguistic syllabus that says, okay, today we're going to learn prepositions, which is not something that you would do in real life. So it all builds on the idea that we want to support meaning-focused communication, and that it is all about the communicative process that we want to support, but you need linguistic competence to be able to do that, and you also need interactional competence. But by performing tasks, you will gradually get there. Now, from this cognitive perspective, one of the key elements in SLA is that what we generally, or what has been known or become known for as the noticing hypothesis by Dick Schmidt, and it's said that you need attent to form in order to learn. So, and attention is virtually necessary for basically everything in language learning, otherwise you won't be able to learn it. So, as a designer of material, supporter of language learning, you want to kind of try to figure out, okay, how can we support that people actually attend to those formal bits that they need? Because when we usually, especially when you understand a language you don't know yet, you probably get by just getting a little bit of the content, and quite often you don't really need the form. But in order to learn it and be successful, it is important to have actually the formal bits as well. And based on that idea, it's also a well-known idea in second language acquisition that production is more important than perception. So at the initial bits, you can learn a lot from intake, from listening, from reading, but by the time you actually have to produce it yourself, your attention is much more focused to form, because you start thinking, how do I actually put that down? how do I actually pronounce it? Is this the correct word order? How, and I want to express past time. How am I going to do that? I know that from my first language, but so how do I do that in the target language I'm learning? So from that sense, I got interested in the idea of SCMC, written synchronous computer-mediated communication, because it is a form of output, and output is known to be an important factor. So the other thing that brought me in, or brought my interest into SCMC, is that it's all over. We all do it. I mean, we do it on our phone now quite often, so it would be much more mobile mediated communication. But writing messages has become such a pervasive means of communication in recent years. And the other thing is that it very often happens in a second language. So, yeah, I mean, in my personal life, I always have to actually fight with my phone because it's set to the wrong language. So I switch languages on a daily basis. Like within 10 minutes, I write one message in Dutch and in German and in English, and then it all gets mixed up because it's on the wrong dictionary still. But writing a message quite often happens in a language that you're learning, and it must be something that, in a way, also supports learning, because it has this output function. You are pushed to use it. You're using it. It's there. So, and although we know that it somehow adds to second language acquisition, we still don't know exactly how and why. So there have been some meta-analyses and also some review analyses that looked at the contribution of SCMC to SLA, but we're still far away from knowing exactly how it works. Now, here's just a typical example also to show you a little bit what we're talking about. You have a timestamp, you have two participants. In one of my research projects, participant 6 and participant 1, and they're chatting with each other. And in this example, you see a couple of typical features of SCMC. So it's not, like, say, correct written English, so they don't use capitals. Punctuation is often missing. You do see that there's a back and forth, so it is an interaction, but some of the interaction is not really linear. So this one, don't worry, is not an answer to, so how long have you been in America? But it's still a reaction to, no, lol, I'm a guy, sorry about, no, it's fine, don't worry. So in SCMC, what you see in the chat log is not what actually happens in real life, or the turn-taking. You also see here that sometimes people write two messages after each other. So it is an interaction, but it is clearly also different from spoken interaction. What is different, and how do we think why this might be important for second language acquisition, is that it's what we sometimes call interaction in slow motion, because we type much slower than we speak. The turn-taking happens at a slower pace. And although it is written, it feels much more like spoken. So sometimes it's also referred to as conceptually spoken, but in a written modality. Now, both of these aspects are thought to be very supportive for language learning, because at a slower speed, you have more time to process. The other thing is that the information stays on the screen. So when you're interacting with someone in a second language and it's spoken, once it's gone, it's gone. Whereas when it's written down, you can actually look back and say, oh, what did he say exactly there? How does it refer to? So you can look back in a chat log to understand what was there. And the other thing is that there's quite some time before you actually decide to hit the enter button and your message gets transferred. So you can monitor your own writing, your own message, whereas in spoken interaction, you have to think about it, and then you have pauses, and that's awkward, and so you want to continue. So those three aspects, actually, the slowest speed, the permanence of the input, plus the increased planning time before you decide to transmit your message, are all aspects of SCMC that make us think that it's actually very supportive for second language acquisition because it allows you to attend to form. And as I said before, attention to form is something that we want to promote in language learning. So just to give you a typical model of how in a cognitive perspective you think learning works. So as I said, there is the input, you have some sensory memory, some sensory information that decides on, okay, do I process this information, yes or no? We're all quite good now at the moment to not process the noise from outside. So our attention actually decides, okay, that's not important. Let's focus on what I actually want to listen to. And that then gets into our memory system, gets processed, and if you process it long enough, there will be an exchange to long-term memory, which in the end might develop into something you've learned. So that's a very simple perspective on this. But as said before, attention is necessary because it's here, that it's like a filter. Only what attention lets us to go through will in the end have a chance to enter our long-term memory, which in a way is a definition of that it has been learned. So in that's the conceptual framework from SLA and SCMC. Now, in my own research, what I got interested in at one point is how much do we learn from each other. So if we're all second language learners and we communicate in, for example, English as our shared second language, what do we learn from each other? And I think we do learn actually quite a lot because I know different things than you know, and together we have a bigger shared knowledge. So if I can learn something from you, you can learn something from me. And that's something that I would like to explore as an SLA researcher. Now, one of the theories that has been quite powerful has been actually prominent in different areas of language research, and depending on where you come from, you either call it alignment, accommodation, convergence, priming, shadowing. It refers to a phenomenon that when we talk to each other, when we interact with each other, we're inclined to reuse the language of our partner we're communicating with. This is something we automatically do. It's an implicit behavior. It's not something we can control it, but it is very normal, natural to do this. If I go out and tell you and say, oh, actually I went to IKEA yesterday and I bought a new sofa, you could ask, so what's the color of your couch? But it's much more natural to say, what's the color of your sofa? And that's basically what we call alignment. So you use some language and I align to it. And together it helps us to come to a shared understanding. In a more political sense, you would call it, whether you call someone a freedom fighter, a rebel, or a terrorist, or something else. So depending on whether you align on your shared conceptual model, yes or no, you also share the language. And what we know from a lot of that's more psycholinguistic research is that this actually happens at any linguistic level. So lexically, so when you share the words, but also syntax. So if someone keeps using passive constructions, you're also much more inclined to use passive constructions. Pragmatics. So indeed, if someone keeps calling you sir or madam, you probably also use the same kind of phrases, or the final words at the end of an email. You quite often kind of say, okay, let's use the same introduction as I was addressed by. And if someone actually breaches that, we also get a bit confused or sometimes even angry because it's, hey, what happens here? So alignment is something we do. It's natural, it's implicit, it's automatic. However, from a second language perspective, there are quite some situations where you might not be able to align, or you might choose not to align. So one of the things is if you don't know the word someone has been using, you probably don't use it because you feel awkward about it, or if you know that actually, so in German, for example, if you use a subordinate clause, you have to change the order of the finite verb. And if you know, I remember that using a subordinate conjunction, that actually means I have to do something with the word, so let's not do it. On the other hand, when you do communicate with someone that you know is at a higher level, it can be quite a good and powerful strategy to just copy your partner. So, I mean, they know it, so let's do it. So from a second language acquisition perspective, this whole idea of alignment and conversions is what I think much more a deliberate decision than an automatic and implicit behavior. And that's the basic research question I have. So there has been earlier work in L2 pedagogy. L2 stands for second language. With the idea that this type of alignment can be a driving force to have students use language they try to avoid, they don't use because they're very infrequent, or because they're insalient, so they just don't notice them. But if you actually have a partner that keeps using it, we can draw on this more automatic implicit behavior to see whether people start using it. And it's mainly the work by McDonough, but also, is she here? Yeah, Kim. So those two have been quite productive in the sense of looking at how we can use it in L2 pedagogy, and they used it for all kinds of different linguistic features. So what I already said, passive-active voice, so I baked the cake, or the cake was baked by me. Double dative constructions, so things like I gave the book to Peter, or I gave Peter the book. WH questions, so anything that starts with a what, why, where, when. Relative clauses in all kinds of, so whether you have subject, object, or even indirect object relative clauses, and word stress. So it even has been used on at the phonological level, so in pronunciation, where they actually looked at where to stress trisyllabic words, so which can be difficult for a second language learner. Now, what I looked at, and this is work with Michel Stiefenhöfer, who will start her PhD soon this year, but at that time she was still an MA student of mine at Mannheim University. And we looked at the use of subjunctive in Spanish. Now, those of you who have learned some Romance languages might remember that there is this something that's called subjunctive. It's something that we use to express doubt. It's insecure, we don't know yet. Now, the thing with subjunctive is that you learn it in school. It's something that receives quite some attention in language teaching, but it's very insalient. It's quite often just the ending of a word. And so learners quite often tend to avoid it, even though they know it, but they just, let's not use it. So in this project, we looked at German teacher trainees of Spanish, and they were interacting with each other. They were at an intermediate level, higher intermediate level almost. And as you see here in the examples, it's just the e here at the end. In a non-subjunctive case, it would be an a. So you would say final le gusta instead of final le guste. Now, in spoken interaction, it's very easy to not hear it at all. But when you write, you might actually do see it. So what we asked him to do is we asked him to work on 20 minutes of chat interactions, written chat interactions. Each of them was on a different topic. And we gave one of our participants a list of sentences that included subjunctives and said, when you're conversing with your partner, please use these sentences. We didn't tell them it's about a subjunctive. We just said, okay, make sure you use a couple out of these, so 7 out of the 9 given sentences in your conversation. And what we were interested in is that, okay, when we do this, does the partner start using the sentences as well, or the form, subjunctive form as well? How did we look at it? So here's contributions of the different participants. And so this was a typical sentence that they took from the sheet, but then they also used something themselves. So in a later contribution, they started using it themselves, and that's what we coded as original use. So we had given use and original use. And I call it here a priming condition, so the alignment condition. I said it's being used quite interchangeably with the different tasks, but you see already these are the three different tasks, task 1, 2, and 3, that in the priming condition there was much more original use of subjunctive, and this was with both participants. So also the one who actually was asked to use those given sentences, also themselves, they did something like what we probably call self-priming. They started using subjunctives much more often. The interesting thing is that actually they were already quite accurate. So in terms of means, these are exactly the same level. So whether they were in a control condition or in the priming condition, they were at a level that was at least 65 of accuracy. So this is typically a structure that is known. They know about it, they just avoid it. But by a very simple manipulation, we actually managed to have them use it. We performed a second study with a different group of learners, but with very similar characteristics, where we actually asked them to do this as a homework task. So the first task was they sat with each other in a big computer lab and they were chatting with each other, which was also a bit awkward because why would you chat with someone who's sitting there in the written mode? So we said, let's try to make it like more natural and put it as a homework task for their Spanish class. And again, what we did see is that in the priming condition, they used it more often. But, and that's why I put it like min-max scores, you also see that quite a few of them did not use any subjunctive at all. So this is the total score of all participants. So there were some people who were just not using it. Fair enough, that's what people do. You have your learners and they not always do what you tell them to do, and it's part of language learning also that you take your own way. So, but what you also see, I mean, none of this is statistically significant because these are very small numbers. And that's something that we see in basically all of the pedagogic research so far, that you do find an effect, but it's very, very small, which is something that you would probably also expect given the implicit nature of it. Now, this is just a slightly different figure where I also said, okay, the percentage of participants that actually use at least one subjunctive. And again, in the priming condition, we had higher figures all over. Differences are not huge, but they do create contexts more often where you have to use the subjunctive, and they do use the form also more often. So I did a third study, and I'm going through this fairly quickly, where I looked at a group of German high school or English high school girls who were learning German in Liverpool. And again, they worked on 3 chat interactions with each other. And this time I was targeting this word order in subordinate clauses, so where you have to put the finite verb at the end of the sentence. And again, they had some model sentences, one of them. So here Tina is using a sentence, this is wichtig, weil es ein Interview ist, with the finite verb at the final position. And then her partner Gabi uses a different original sentence, but with the same format. So her chatted, the finite verb is at the end of the sentence. She also used, so here, there's another example, so das ist allen gefällt. And then we have someone who says, okay, then wie es allen gefällt, which is actually wrong because then is a coordinating conjunction, and there the word order is different. So, but then a few turns later, she uses another original sentence where the word order is correct again. So in all these studies so far, what I've seen is that they use it, there is something going on, but the numbers are very, very small. In this last study with the German learners, I also did a focus group interview, and in their reports, they say things about, oh, I really like this because when you see their answer, you can use that. You can use it like what they said and work on it. Or further down, so you can see how they structure their sentences, and you see how they say it, and you can compare your own contribution with their contribution. So also from these focus group interview comments, I got it as it's something we do. So that's the interim summary of priming. Seems to be something that happens also in the second language acquisition context. It elicits more use. It elicits more accurate use. It elicits also more obligatory context. It seems to be something that makes students use it, and they also experience it as learning. So they also actually said in the interviews that, yeah, I learned something. Now, the big thing with all this work so far is that it's all based on the chat log. So at the end of it, I copied the chat log and I started analyzing that and looked at what do they actually work with together. And here you have a typical example. Again, so I come from China and I'm 20 years old. What about you? And this keeps moving, but it should be here, the circle. So the second circle should be how about you? It's the same structure in a way, very similar wording. But you could argue that, okay, this is a line. You see, there's quite a distance between the two. And then you say, has it been just used accidentally? Or is this really something that is based on strategic behavior, copying, looking at what your partner has written? So in a way, doing a chat log analysis is taking a very static approach to a very dynamic process. And that's where I started to contact Michel Smith, my collaborator at Arizona State University, who has published a couple of studies beforehand on eye tracking. Now, eye tracking, and I'll get a little bit more into that, is means to look at where people look at when they work on the screen. And the big question we have now is actually, so can we use eye tracking methodology to look at SCMC? And for the purpose of this work, I have actually coined it or used the acronym in a different way, because the big problem with SCMC is that it is spontaneously created and moving constantly. You don't know what will be on the screen, and you don't know where it is, because every time someone hits the enter button, it moves. Now, eye tracking is something that's usually done in a lab condition. Lab context, you know exactly how many sentences people will look at, where it's on the screen, how long it's presented, and then you measure it. So it's really different from what we aim to do here. Eye tracking is a colloquial term for recording eye movements. Now, why would we look at eye movements? The basic idea behind eye tracking is that there is a link between what we look at and what we're processing. So our overt attention to something on a screen is directly linked to what we are processing at that very moment in our mind. And that's usually referred to as the eye-mind link. So in terms of if I want to know, have they actually processed that information of their partner? Eye tracking can be a powerful way. How does it look like? It used to be much more intrusive, so you have kind of like a stand and you were tied to it. Nowadays, it's much more often like a small box here. On this one, our PhD student went to Sri Lanka, and you can't even see it because it's there. That's the little eye tracking, and I brought my own little one here. So this is how the eye tracking machine nowadays looks. So it has become much more handy, also affordable. This one is $100 only. Doesn't come with any software, so that's the hard bit. But it's something we can use nowadays. And this is what you get as an output. Let's see whether this works. So here we have participant 5 and participant 2 chatting with each other. And you see here, the dot means where they're looking at. And you saw that it was quite a long time that she actually focused on A, qualitative data. You see that the participant above it, I think it's quantitative. And then you see that she actually corrects herself and comes with an own statement that said, I think it was qualitative data without the A. So I interpret this as there was heightened attention to the article, thinking that she was actually thinking about, do I need the article, yes or no? And then because her partner uses this sentence without the article, she's convinced that, okay, let's leave it out. So she also leaves out the article. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So you see a long attention to A. Yeah, the bigger the dot, the longer they look at. Sorry, I should have told that. So you see that at the moment that her partner's contribution comes up, she reads it, deletes her own contribution, and comes up with a corrected version. And this is basically what I think, okay, this is how we learn from each other when we chat. This is another, so this is an example of what we would actually measure when we look at eye tracking. So here, what you see is the dots. Those are representing fixations, where we look at. The bigger the dot, the longer you looked at it. So here there was an attention to find the groups while she was actually writing herself. I like to find the, and you can't see it here, but she's writing find the groups. So she did look back, had quite a long fixation on it. Okay? So that's one thing we're interested in. And in order to find it out, how long people looked at something, you have to draw something around what we call an area of interest. So you look at the screen recording, you define an area of interest, and that's where you then extract the time, the duration, and also the number of fixations we are doing. So you usually have to count on the duration of how long people looked at something. Now, again, as your target is moving all the time, and you don't know beforehand what will be your target, we had to come up with our own methodology. So the question Brian and I had here was, to what extent does alignment occur in task-based SCMC? So when people learn, does it happen? And then how can we use eye tracking methodology? Is it insightful? Right, so we have both a theoretical and a methodological aim at saying, okay, what can we learn from it about alignment, but also how can we broaden our methodological tools in SCMC research? In this study, we used we had 14 MA participants, some of them here, some of them in Arizona State. They chatted with each other on a total of 6 tasks. You see they had a range of different backgrounds. Typical MA students, so they were at the level of 5.5 to 7 in the IELTS score. And only 6 of them we actually attached to the eye tracker. So with the others, we did the usual chat log analyses, but here I report on those 6 cases only. And you'll hear soon why it's only 6, because it's just so laborious. This is what they did. Typical pre-test, post-test design. We started with a social chat where they got to know each other a little bit, talking about where you're from and what are you studying. And then they did a total of 3 experimental tasks, 6 experimental tasks. And their task was to rewrite or reconstruct an academic abstract. So we gave them an abstract that was blocked in the beginning, middle, and ending part. And one part was always only presented in bullet points. And we asked them to discuss with each other, so how would I reconstruct that section? So, and 2 sessions were on the reconstruction of the beginning, 2 sessions on the reconstruction of the middle, and 2 sessions on the reconstruction of the ending. So every time different abstracts, but they were all abstracts that were in computer-assisted language learning. And as they were all students of applied linguistics, this was also relevant, actually, content-wise. So they were eager to find out about it. So here's an example, again, of how it works. So they had a split screen with on one side the prompt, the task prompt, and then this is where they're writing with each other. You see that this participant is reading the prompt, but is also reading what the partners are. The partners just added perhaps anonymity and L2 motivation, increases no effect on L2 vocabulary learning. And at one point, I was going back to read the instructions and the models, and then we just have to wait briefly because she's going to correct herself after she knows about it. Let's wait. Adding or perhaps, again, a typical context of alignment where she says, okay, let's pragmatically make it more, nicer actually for this conversation. We did look at the screen recordings and identified single words that were used. So they copied each other's single words. But we also found things where, like examples of what we would call multi-word units, so expressions like find the groups, where we always could say, okay, when they are writing it, they actually have been looking at their partner's contribution beforehand. Even at a more syntactic level, we had something where she was writing add to our discussion, and she was actually writing herself, we have to add this to our middle part. So before writing, we have to add this to our middle part. She was looking back to this add to our discussion. So it's a similar phrase with some lexical overlap, but a lot of it is also original, so it's much more at the syntactic level. So based on these explorations, we could see that our participants used very different techniques when we're actually writing. So participant 1 used basically everything that was on the screen, kept looking around and did a lot of editing before hitting the enter button. And especially when her partner contributed something, she looked at her own screen and said, oh no, that's wrong, and she kind of deleted it to make it more aligning into a nice conversation. Participant 2 is what we call a hit and peck writer, so looking like this, and then looking what have I written. She quite often kind of ignores the contributions of her partner. So she's so much busy with writing her own contributions that she not really looked a lot at her partner's writing, but mainly on her own. And the third one was also, that's more me. So writing and hitting the enter button and then see what kind of rubbish you've written and then have to correct it afterwards. She did quite some alignment at the lexical level. So she used a lot she really used her partner's contribution to correct her spelling and word choices. So based on these more qualitative explorations, we do see that eye tracking helps us to understand a bit more what people do when they interact. But we were also more interested in, okay, can we find something at a more quantitative level? So how often does this occur? Especially also because in all those earlier pedagogic tasks, it has always been such a small effect. So what we then did for the quantitative analysis is we followed 3 steps. First, we had to identify overlap between the 2 partners. So where is there any lexical overlap? And then draw our areas of interest around those pieces of overlap and then see, okay, how often do they actually look at it, and then compare that to normal gaze behavior. So this is how we identified overlap. We used the corpus technique, which is called n-gram analysis. So we looked at all multi-word units of 3 or more words that were the same in the 2 partners' contributions. For example, the researcher's name used by participant 6 was again used by participant 1. P6 uses here writing and pictorial annotations, and again also participant 1 uses it. So just by doing basically an overlap based on the chat logs, we looked at what was there.
Can I check with an n-gram analysis? Does that mean it's exactly the same or is it, if the suffixes have changed, does that still count? So if they say researching, does it count with researchers, or is it?
At this point, we only looked at exact lexical overlap, which is a very valid point, because it would be much nicer if we could do it at a more abstract level. And we're thinking about that now, but to be honest, this has taken already such a long time. So we're progressing very slowly on this project. But that's definitely something we would like to include. Yeah, so the laborious part is that we had to draw all these areas of interest around the possible primes. So those aspects of it, okay, here there's overlap. Also around our baseline. And basically, every time someone hits the enter button, it goes to a new place. So you have to deactivate it, copy it to the new place. And then, and for some of those phrases, there were like 24, 25 new positions until it was off the screen. So my research assistant, I call him poor Kuchang, because he spent hours on doing this. And we're still not finished with it. It's only the 6 participants, but we've only coded 5 so far, so waiting for the last one. Now, as we have our possible primes and the baseline, which was just a normal conversation, looking at normal gaze behavior, we then have to correct those eye movements for length, because the longer the word, the longer you need to look at it. So what we basically did, we adjusted it just for number of characters, so letters with spaces basically, and we looked at how long did they look at it and how often. So when they went back, they had more fixations, and divided that by the letters with spaces, so the number of characters basically of each one. So in the example with the pictorial and the annotation, that's such a long stretch of words, it's much longer, so you have to make sure you compare the same things. Now, this is an example of what we found for the 6 participants. So far, we haven't coded all the baseline data yet, but there were a total for all our 6 participants in 6 conversations. We only had 82 possible primes, so where there was exact overlap. 11% we had to throw out because we didn't get any gaze behavior at all, and then 17% on top of that we had to also discard because there was no fixation in that area. And then when you look at these numbers, so this is the adjusted figures, you see that they're very fluctuating. There's a large individual difference in how long people look at it and also how often they fixate it. So it goes from 867 to 285. And just to count it up to words, I've just said, okay, per word, if a word typically has 5 letters, this would mean you look at it for about 550 milliseconds, 2.6 times. So that's average gaze behavior on those. We then, just focusing on the 3 first people that Brian in Arizona already analyzed. When you compare the baseline data with those possible primes with the alignment data, you already see that there's a bit more time here and also a higher count on here. And when we then put this in a regression analysis, both of those factors, so looking at how long they look at it and how often they look at it, only how often, so the fixation count, came actually out as a predicting factor, whereas the duration didn't really matter. So we only used fixation count. So, okay, let's not look at the duration, but only at the count. And there we found a high, so 52% here, that actually came out as a powerful predictor of whether, so how often they looked back at it actually did make a difference on whether they actually afterwards used it, yes or no, whereas duration wasn't. And this is just a different graph. What this is, everything that's here is a B is an instance of one of those 82 that we had targeted as a baseline, whereas the A's are those that we target as alignment. And if we predicted it to be a baseline, the model quite often predicted it as a baseline. So you see there's not a lot of B's in this area. Whereas there's quite a few A's here, which means that we had predicted it to be alignment, but it actually ended up in the model as being a baseline, so being much more equal to the baseline data. So in a way, it's just these few cases that received more attention in terms of a higher fixation count than our usual normal gaze behavior. And this is the same picture, but in a different way to show it. And only those that are green are those, and you see it here as the numbers, that received a substantially higher count than the baseline data. Now, what were those cases that we looked at, those that were identified as being aligned? You see that so based on these instances, it's not really a pattern that we can see so far. So you see even that something like better than online, it was one time aligned, but one time it wasn't aligned. So we don't know yet what kind of language actually made people align or did not make them align. That's still an open question, but that's the next step. So the conclusion based on this project is that only 36% of our possible primes were in the end identified by receiving more attention than the baseline data. And that in a way also explains that's probably why we don't find strong priming effects when we look at chat log analyses. So at this point, I do think that eye tracking gives us a better picture. And also the combination of this corpus n-gram analysis and eye tracking is something that is worth pursuing. But it remains such a laborious task. So, and this is the final bit. The question still remains how we can fruitfully measure eye gaze data in SCMC. And with another collaborator, Lawrence Anthony, who has been a visiting scholar here last year at the Corpus Institute from Waseda University in Tokyo. You might be familiar with him because he has designed AntConc, which is something that's quite powerful. We're currently working on something that turns around the way how we measure eye gaze data. So instead of me defining where do I want the fixations from, he has built something, but it's not entirely finished yet, that gives me an output list of the words people looked at. So I now get an output list of saying, okay, they looked at overseas, at going overseas, where I already say, okay, there were 2 times they actually looked at overseas. And this removes the whole exercise of drawing those areas of interest, because I just get an output list of which words did they look at, how long did they look at it. And from repetitions here in the output list, I can actually also see, okay, how many counts were there. And I hope that we'll find some money first to get him over again so that we can find the time to work and develop this further. So that's my long story. I think I used a bit more, but
yes.
Thank you for your attention. And
thank you. Okay, so Marije has shown us how second language learning can be viewed in terms of not only how it might be developed through use of technology and is being developed through use of technology, but also how technologies can be used to do the analysis, to look at it in much more detail, which I think has been fascinating. So thank you for that. I'm going to now open up the floor for questions, and I think, yeah. So, any questions?
I'm going to jump in. Not so much with a question, but just with fun, because I've got to SCMC, again, without the awareness. It's amazing. It's just
Thank
really,
you.
really interesting to think that what we're doing is them being influenced. I can certainly recognise the way in which people will pick up and follow on what they're talking about when you're in spoken language. So to actually see it in that written way is fascinating.
Thank you.
And I will look forward to talking to colleagues afterwards about how the conversation goes and listening to the video.
Yeah,
so
good. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Can I ask for some more water, or is there?
Please.
I just take some.
Yeah.
Sorry, some juice probably. You're welcome. Yeah. Thank you, Henri. Yes.
Try not to jump in.
You'll email them. Okay, so it's really evolved a lot, I think.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I'll try and hone it down to one or two. Any?
Can I just ask a really obvious question, which is, did you test your participants' typing skills? What kind of,
Not for this project. So there's all kinds of, because this was really the first one we can do. So there's all kinds of things we want to do. Typing skills, because obviously these are second language learners, and all of them came from a different script. So all of them also come from a different keyboard. That definitely has an effect on it. And all of them have been here in the UK or in the States, or I mean, they have been typing on English keyboards for some months at least, but that's definitely something that has an effect. Yeah.
With categories you were describing as
The hit and peck rider. Yeah.
Would be similar to whether you're a touch type or whether you're not.
Yeah.
Which might affect your.
Yeah. I mean, the good thing of the software we use at the moment with for the eye tracking is that it also has a user camera, so it actually also makes a video of the people. So when you look at the screen recording, you also see whether they're looking down or at the screen. So you can code actually for that. But that accounts definitely for part of the, let's call, missing data, where it said, like, yeah, we had to discard 11% and 17% of the data because there was just no gaze on the screen. Yeah.
Other questions?
There were any instances where students were actually just discussing the structure of the.
I mean, like a real focus on form. Not so much, do I remember. I think they were very meaning-oriented, because the studies themselves, so the bullet pointed summaries, they were quite a challenge. So there was quite a few, like, more lexical, more meaning-oriented discussions. So, for example, the F2F or CMC, some of them also were not familiar with those abbreviations, so they tried to find out what does it mean. Yeah, I don't remember exact form-related discussions. No.
The question when there's generally using the same word, wouldn't you just think of explaining it as what's on needed and kind of consideration more of self-esteem, or how their peer would see them, and how they're, how they express language.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that, and that's, if you look at, so I call it alignment or priming, but if you look at the literature that deals with this, like the overlapping speech or the copying speech, if you see it more in terms of accommodation theory, that's where you would situate that. Is it that you indeed you align because you want to come to a shared common ground. So that's a bit. I still think that with many differences, I think, between first language and second language use, that in a second language this can be much more a strategic behavior, both in terms of, yes, I do align, or I choose not to align. Whereas I think in the first language, it's really, I don't know whether you have been aware that you've been doing this for the past years of your life. It is something we do. And sometimes we are aware of it, but I think most of the time in your daily language, you're not aware of it. Whereas in the second language, I said, it can be quite a powerful strategy. And the thing is also I said, okay, only 30% in the end was shown to be accompanied by overt attention, engaged behavior. So the way of interpreting this is either to say, okay, they didn't align the others, or they probably aligned but at an implicit level, so where they were not consciously aligning, but that were the automatic processes. And only in those 30% where we could actually see some gaze behavior, it was much more strategic behavior. But yeah, another thing we would like to do is to use stimulated recalls on this, so to replay the conversation to our participants and ask them, so you look at this, why do you look at it? And whether they then report on saying, okay, yeah, actually, I found that expression very well, so I wanted to use it in my own contribution, so that we have some more reporting data as well.
Thank you. Rebecca?
So I just wanted, do the students know each other? Are they complete strangers to each other? And why do you choose it?
So, I said part of them were in Arizona and part of them were here.
Okay, so you were literally pairing them?
Deliberately, yeah. So, but and I said, so they had this first chat session where they got to know each other, but very briefly. It was 20 minutes, and it was also for them to adjusting to the system and being able to sit in a computer and work at it. So it was very much yeah. But it was also more deliberate decision, because if they do know each other, you get it all. Yeah, it can go basically anywhere. So you wouldn't know if they're friends. They would start all of a sudden in some kind of jargon we wouldn't understand. And if we pair some people up that we know they don't like each other, they probably strategically choose not to use the same. So it was quite a deliberate decision to have separate people. Yeah.
And why that particular time?
So we gave them these tasks because there were all students in our department, and my partner also works in applied linguistics. So we made sure that those were really relevant studies also for themselves. So it was about, we wanted to make sure that their conversation was actually meaningful. And after the chat discussion, they were actually writing their reconstruction, but that was an individual task. So so we just wanted to push them to say, okay, you can learn, or by discussing this with your partner, you will be better able to write your individual piece afterwards. So it's much more in a way of making it meaningful to them. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions I have asked already. That's great. One of the things I was interested in is thinking about where to potentially go with this. Is through Google Docs, and if you're interested, I'll try to dig it out. There's been some work recently that shows that you can quite simply completely reconstruct all the edits in real time on a Google document. So if you wanted to break out of just this sort of CMC type thing and actually look at something where it's either the pre-task and the post-task, or look at where you said individually we asked them to do some writing, you could then compare gaze tracking with that, and that's actually relatively simple.
It's so Laura Stiefenhöfer, with whom I did, who starts as a PhD, that's actually exactly her project. So she wants to look at collaborative writing tasks in for example, a Google Docs environment. and but again using also eye tracking. So,
Okay.
so what I'm doing in another project now is also that we include what we call keystroke logging. So where you look at what was typed and then you can reconstruct the whole typing issue. Then it becomes even more important to look at typing skills. But I think there's still, the question I think is with writing is always, okay, what do people read while they write? And that's whether you do it in an SCMC context or in a usual writing task. There are a lot of models about how we read and how reading feeds into writing. But I think the use of eye tracking, where we can actually see what people looked at when there is a pause or when they revise, can give us much more information.
One of the things that I've noticed that's changed perhaps the most in the software is that little thing that says the other person is typing. Was that in this software you were using, and how much do people look at that? Because I think that that's, you're writing a reply and you see the other person is typing, so you wait, and then you realise that actually they're typing on something completely different.
Now, I did, so in this software, I just used Skype, actually. I used Skype also because in Skype you can set the letter. You probably noticed that it's much bigger, and so in order to be able to do the eye gaze measures, you need like a bit of font, and you need a font where every letter has the same space. And in Skype you do see when your partner is typing. Anecdotally, I've used this in another project where we actually used Moodle chat, and you can see in Moodle chat when your partner is typing. And all of my participants came back and said, oh, it was really awkward because I couldn't see when the other one was typing. So we are so much used to this fact that you can actually see it, that we find it disturbing if we can't. And it definitely has an impact.
And if you look at the sort of the literature on turn-taking structures, there's quite a lot of sort of conversation analysis applied to this.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's something that's totally different, because it's in conversation you can see if the other person, like, I will now look at Don, see if he wants me to stop. But exactly in this situation you can see if somebody else has their hand up and so on. And it's kind of like that. And when that goes, the incoherence that comes in is massive.
Yeah.
You've got to look back. So
the thing I think so I haven't looked at the conversation analysis literature, but I'm aware of it, that it exists. And the interesting thing is, I think with chat interactions, we by now have acknowledged that this happens. So what you quite often see, and I quoted O'Rourke, so Breffney O'Rourke from Trinity College Dublin. He has looked at it, and quite often you see like several threads of conversation going on in parallel, but I mean, people who chat often, they already know about it and have acknowledged it, and we are already, we know how to deal with it. So that's, it is an interesting angle. I think it's definitely worth looking at. Yeah.
Other questions. I mean, I had a question, Marije, which is, in learning, one of the things which is said to be really important is the things that we forget are potentially more important than the things that we remember. Now, in psychological terms, of course, that's particularly important. Yes.
Mm.
In this sort of research that you're doing, are you picking up any of that at all? That there are things that are surprisingly not noticed or missed or not remembered, which maybe you would expect to see them being used in some way.
Yeah, so in this specific project, we haven't looked at it. Something that goes into that direction, and that's another project in a paper that Brian has published with Shannon Soro together. That's where they analyzed so they made an analysis of what was typed, what was revised, and what was put in afterwards. So basically, because you have to screen record, and you can actually see what was deleted and what new text did they put on. So that will probably go a little bit into the direction of saying, okay, what was the final product instead of what we see that's going on in the online process. I do think, because it's still such a new area, there are tons of questions still to explore. And one of the questions I have at the moment is whether your partner, so because this was peer interaction, but we want to put it now in a manipulation actually where your interactant is a tutor or at least a more knowledgeable person, and whether you are more prone to actually acknowledge or pick up something from someone who you know that's actually is an expert than when you chat with a peer. There is quite a lot of research on what we would call recasting. So if you chat with a tutor or an interactor with a more knowledgeable person and they correct you, or give you some feedback, and what we have or what we know from that research is that quite often, and that's probably also your question was targeting that formal aspects are much less noticed than lexical aspects. So even if so the tutor gives a recast that has a formal aspect, so a correction that targets some form issue, it's quite often experienced as more a lexical or meaning-oriented. Right? So there is research where they did destimulated recalls, and then they asked, oh, you got a correction here. So, oh no, it was just an acknowledgement of what I said. So, and that's, I think from a pedagogic perspective, that's really important to know, because then we can think of other ways of highlighting, enhancing, letting students know, okay, it's actually important that you look at this as a support to language learning. So, but that's, yeah, the things that don't get noticed, I think that's definitely an avenue we have to explore further.
Thank you. Okay. Any more questions or comments? Okay. So, thank you very much.
Thank you
for coming along and giving a really, really interesting talk, and exposing us to different perspectives on this from a technology and learning point of view with regard to language, which I think is fascinating. So thank you very much.
Thanks again, Simon. What I would also want to briefly pitch is that at the end of June, so 30th of June and 1st of July, we are organizing a conference here, the BAL Language Learning and Teaching SIG, Special Interest Group. And this year our theme is Crossing the Boundaries, Language Learning Inside and Outside the Classroom. And we have quite a few talks that are about online language learning, blended language learning, mobile language learning. So should you be interested, have a look at, it's the BAL, so B-A-A-L, Language Learning and Teaching SIG. And if you can't find it, write me an email and I can forward.
Is any of that being streamed or
no.
made available online? Or
No.
a bunch of people would be really
Yeah. I know. Yeah, no, it's. I think the major technological step that we are currently exploring is whether we can have the conference book on an app instead of. So, but yeah. No streaming for the moment. Yeah. Thank you.